Picture this: you're scrolling through your phone, safe in your comfortable home, when suddenly, you see a news headline that stops you cold. A young woman, barely 25 years old, has vanished without a trace in one of the most dangerous deserts on Earth. The temperature outside is 127 degrees Fahrenheit. She has no water, no food, no way to call for help. The local authorities have given up searching. Her family has been told to prepare for the worst. But what they don't know is that somewhere in a classified military facility, a group of America's most elite soldiers just received an emergency briefing. These aren't ordinary soldiers. They're Delta Force operators, the kind of men who slip into enemy territory in the dead of night and complete missions that officially never happened. Tonight, they're not hunting terrorists or rescuing diplomats. Tonight, they're racing against time to find one lost American woman before the desert claims another victim. This isn't a Hollywood movie. This isn't a novel. This is the true story of how the most elite military unit in the world dropped everything to save someone they'd never met, in a place where hope goes to die, against odds that would make seasoned veterans shake their heads in disbelief. Her name was Sarah Chen, and, by all accounts, she should have died in that desert. The fact that you're reading this story means something extraordinary happened. Something that proves heroes still exist, even in the darkest corners of our world. Sarah Chen had always been drawn to places that tested human limits. As a documentary photographer specializing in conflict zones and remote locations, she had captured images in war-torn Syria, documented life in the Amazon rainforest, and spent weeks in Siberian wilderness settlements. But nothing had prepared her for the assignment that would nearly cost her life in the Dashti Kavr Desert of Iran. The Iranian desert, known locally as the Great Salt Desert, spans over 30,000 square miles of some of the most inhospitable terrain on planet Earth. Unlike the sandy dunes people imagine when they think of deserts, this wasteland consists of salt flats, mud plains, and rocky outcrops that can reach temperatures hot enough to cook an egg on the ground. During summer months, surface temperatures regularly exceed 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause third-degree burns through the soles of boots. Sarah had been commissioned by National Geographic to document the effects of climate change on ancient Persian trade routes. These paths, once traveled by caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious stones, were now abandoned corridors through increasingly harsh landscape. Her editor, Marcus Williams, had specifically chosen her for this assignment because of her proven ability to work alone in dangerous conditions and her reputation for capturing images that told stories words could never convey. The planning phase had taken 6 months. Sarah worked with Iranian government officials to obtain the necessary permits, consulted with local guides, and studied satellite imagery of her intended route. She planned to spend 3 weeks photographing a specific section of ancient Silk Road that ran through the heart of the desert, documenting how rising temperatures and changing weather patterns were erasing these historical pathways forever. Her preparation was meticulous. She carried enough water for 5 days, high-energy food supplies, advanced GPS equipment, satellite communication devices, and professional camera gear worth more than most people's cars. Her vehicle was a specially modified Toyota Land Cruiser equipped with extra fuel tanks, reinforced cooling systems, and emergency survival equipment. She had informed the Iranian authorities of her exact route and scheduled regular check-ins every 12 hours via satellite phone. On the morning of July 15, Sarah began her journey from the small desert town of Garmsar, located about 100 kilometers southeast of Tehran. The town served as the last outpost of civilization before the desert proper began. Local residents watched her depart with expressions that mixed admiration with concern. They had seen other foreigners venture into the desert with confidence, and they knew the desert always won in the end. For the first 2 days, everything proceeded according to plan. Sarah made her scheduled check-ins, captured stunning photographs of ancient stone markers and abandoned caravanserai buildings, and documented GPS coordinates of significant archaeological features. Her satellite phone calls to her editor were brief but encouraging. She reported excellent weather conditions, clear skies, and remarkable photographic opportunities. Her photographs from those first days would later be described as some of the most haunting desert imagery ever captured. She documented the skeletal remains of ancient buildings being slowly consumed by salt and sand, rusted metal artifacts from more recent travelers who hadn't survived their journeys, and the strange beauty of landscapes so hostile to life that it resembled alien terrain. The third day marked the beginning of her ordeal, though she wouldn't realize it for several hours. Sarah had planned to photograph a particular section of ancient road that appeared clearly on historical maps but had never been properly documented by modern cameras. According to her research, this section contained the ruins of a major rest stop used by Persian merchants over 1,000 years ago. She left her base camp early that morning, driving roughly 20 kilometers north of her established position. The ruins were supposed to be located near a distinctive rock formation that was clearly visible on satellite images. Sarah carried her day pack with camera equipment, 2 liters of water, emergency supplies, and her GPS devices. She planned to return to her main camp before the afternoon heat became dangerous. The rock formation was exactly where it was supposed to be, rising from the desert floor like an ancient monument. Sarah spent several hours photographing the area from different angles, documenting how the morning light revealed details invisible during other times of day. She discovered pottery fragments, bits of metal that might have been parts of ancient tools, and stone foundations that clearly indicated human habitation. As she worked, Sarah became increasingly absorbed in her photography. This was exactly the kind of discovery that made her career worthwhile, the moment when history revealed itself through her camera lens. She moved further from her vehicle than she had originally planned, following traces of what appeared to be ancient road markers leading deeper into the desert. When she finally looked up from her camera, the sun was directly overhead and her vehicle was nowhere in sight. The rock formation that had served as her landmark was also missing from view. In every direction, the landscape looked identical, flat, sun-baked earth stretching to the horizon under a sky so bright it hurt to look at directly. Sarah's first reaction was annoyance rather than fear. She was an experienced navigator who had worked in remote locations around the world. Getting temporarily disoriented was part of the job, and she had prepared for this possibility. She pulled out her primary GPS device and pressed the power button. Nothing happened. She tried again, holding the button longer. The screen remained black. Her backup GPS device suffered from the same problem. Both units had been functioning perfectly that morning, but now they were completely dead. Sarah checked the batteries, tried different settings, and even attempted to restart the devices multiple times. Nothing worked. The extreme heat had apparently damaged the electronic components despite the fact that both devices were rated for desert conditions. This was when the first wave of genuine concern began to settle in her stomach. Without GPS, she had no way to determine her exact location or plot a course back to her vehicle. She tried to remember the direction she had walked from her truck, but the landscape offered no distinctive features to serve as reference points. Every direction looked the same. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and think logically. Panic was the enemy in survival situations, and she had been trained to handle emergencies during her years of working in dangerous locations. She had water, she had some food, and people knew where she was supposed to be. If she failed to make her scheduled check-in that evening, search teams would be activated. She began walking in what she believed was the direction of her vehicle, stopping every few minutes to scan the horizon for any sign of the distinctive rock formation or her white Land Cruiser. The temperature was rising rapidly as the sun climbed higher, and she could feel sweat beginning to soak her clothing despite her efforts to conserve moisture. After walking for what felt like an hour, Sarah realized she might be moving in the wrong direction. The landscape remained uniformly flat and featureless. Worse, she was no longer certain she could find her way back to the spot where she had been photographing. The desert had swallowed her trail as completely as if she had never existed. She decided to stop walking and wait for the temperature to drop before continuing her search. Moving during the hottest part of the day would only exhaust her water supplies faster and increase her risk of heat exhaustion. She found a small depression in the ground that offered minimal shade and settled down to wait and think. As the hours passed, Sarah's situation became increasingly desperate. Her satellite phone was back in her vehicle, along with her main water supplies and emergency equipment. She had perhaps 6 hours of water remaining if she rationed carefully, and the temperature was still climbing toward its afternoon peak.
The silence was absolute.
No aircraft passed overhead, no distant sounds of civilization reached her ears. The only noise was the whisper of wind across sand and the sound of her own breathing. For the first time since beginning her journey, Sarah began to understand that she might actually die in this place. When evening came and she failed to make her scheduled check-in, search protocols would be activated. But Sarah knew that standard search procedures in the Iranian desert were limited by politics, resources, and the simple fact that searching thousands of square miles of identical terrain was nearly impossible. Local authorities would make an effort, but they had limited helicopter fuel, few trained personnel, and no obligation to risk Iranian lives for a foreign photographer who had chosen to enter their desert. As the sun began to set on her first day lost in the Dashti Cavern, Sarah Chen had no way of knowing that her disappearance was about to trigger a chain of events that would reach the highest levels of the United States government, activate the most classified military units in the American arsenal, and demonstrate that some heroic missions happen not because of politics or strategy, but simply because it's the right thing to do. The desert stars appeared above her as temperature began to drop, brilliant and cold in the clear sky. Somewhere far away, people who didn't even know her name were already beginning to mobilize resources that would make the difference between life and death. But Sarah knew none of this as she settled down for what might be the longest night of her life, listening to the silence of a landscape that had claimed countless lives throughout history and showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of their preparation, experience, or determination to survive. Marcus Williams had been Sarah's editor at National Geographic for 4 years, and in that time he had learned to trust her completely. She was punctual with her communications, professional in her conduct, and had never missed a scheduled check-in during any of her assignments. When 8 p.m. Iranian time came and went without word from her, he began to worry. When 10 p.m. passed with no contact, he knew something was seriously wrong. Marcus immediately began working his contacts in the Iranian government, calling numbers he had been given during the permit process. The language barriers were frustrating, and the time zone differences meant he was calling people in the middle of their night. The Iranian officials he reached were polite but not particularly helpful. They promised to look into the matter and suggested he call back during normal business hours. This response was not acceptable to Marcus. He had enough experience with international journalism to know that looking into it could mean anything from immediate action to complete neglect, depending on politics, resources, and the mood of whoever happened to be in charge. He needed to escalate this situation through channels that would get results. His next call was to the U.S. State Department's Emergency Services line. The duty officer who answered was professional and took down all the relevant information, but Marcus could hear in the man's voice that this was being categorized as a routine consular matter. A missing American photographer in Iranian desert would generate paperwork and diplomatic inquiries, but it wouldn't trigger any immediate rescue operations. Marcus understood the political realities. Iran and the United States had complicated diplomatic relations, and American military assets couldn't simply cross into Iranian airspace to search for a missing citizen. Any rescue operation would require Iranian cooperation, and that cooperation would have to be requested through official diplomatic channels. Such requests could take days to process, and Sarah didn't have days. But Marcus had one more card to play. Before becoming an editor, he had served as a Marine Corps photographer in Iraq and Afghanistan. He still maintained friendships with men who had gone on to careers in special operations and intelligence services. One of those men was Colonel James Mitchell, who now worked in a classified position at the Pentagon that Marcus wasn't supposed to know about. The phone call to Mitchell happened at 3 a.m. Eastern Time. Marcus woke up his old friend and explained the situation as clearly and urgently as possible. Sarah Chen was missing in the Iranian desert, Iranian authorities were not taking the situation seriously, and standard diplomatic channels would be too slow to save her life. He needed someone with real authority to understand that an American citizen was going to die unless immediate action was taken. Colonel Mitchell listened without interrupting, asked several specific questions about Sarah's location and timeline, and then told Marcus he would call him back within 2 hours. What Marcus didn't know was that Mitchell worked for a joint special operations command that coordinated activities between different elite military units. More importantly, he had direct access to decision-makers who could authorize operations that technically didn't exist. The call that changed everything happened at 5:30 a.m. Eastern Time, when Mitchell's phone rang in a secure conference room deep inside the Pentagon. On the other end was General Patricia Hawkins, the commanding officer of Joint Special Operations Command. She had been briefed on the situation by Mitchell and had spent the past 2 hours reviewing intelligence reports, satellite imagery, and diplomatic cables. General Hawkins was known throughout the special operations community as someone who made decisions based on capability and necessity rather than politics and paperwork. She had commanded special operations forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several locations that remained classified. Her philosophy was simple: if American special operations forces had the capability to save American lives, then political complications could be dealt with later. The briefing she received painted a clear picture. Sarah Chen was missing in a desert where summertime temperatures could kill an unprepared person within 24 hours. Iranian search and rescue capabilities were limited, and their motivation to risk Iranian lives for an American photographer was questionable. Standard diplomatic channels would take at least 72 hours to produce any meaningful cooperation, and, by that time Sarah would almost certainly be dead. But, American Special Operations Forces had capabilities that could make the difference. Delta Force maintained teams specifically trained for personnel recovery operations in hostile environments. They had aircraft capable of long-range penetration into denied airspace. Most importantly, they had personnel who specialized in desert operations and had extensive experience operating in Middle Eastern conditions. General Hawkins made her decision within minutes of reviewing the briefing materials. She authorized a classified personnel recovery operation with a cover story that would provide diplomatic deniability if the mission went wrong. The official story would be that American satellites had detected possible terrorist activity in the Iranian desert, and a small reconnaissance team had been dispatched to investigate. If pressed, the State Department could claim that any Americans found in Iranian airspace were conducting legitimate counterterrorism operations. The call went out to Delta Force headquarters at Fort Bragg, North Carolina at 6:45 a.m. Eastern Time. Major Alex Rodriguez, the duty officer, received a priority alert that sent him immediately to the Secure Operations Center. The mission brief was unlike anything he had seen during his 8 years with Delta Force. Primary objective was personnel recovery of one American civilian, believed to be alive but in immediate danger due to environmental conditions. Secondary objective was to complete the mission without creating an international incident that could damage U.S.-Iranian diplomatic relations. The operation had to be conducted with complete deniability, meaning if anything went wrong, the United States government would deny any knowledge of American military activity in Iranian airspace. Major Rodriguez immediately began assembling his team. For this type of operation, he needed operators with specific skill sets, desert survival training, medical experience, helicopter insertion capabilities, and the mental toughness to operate in conditions that could kill them as easily as enemy action. He had exactly the right people for the job. Sergeant First Class David Kim was a Korean-American operator who had grown up in Arizona and specialized in desert warfare. He had completed survival training in Nevada, Arizona, and the Sahara Desert, and could navigate by stars when GPS systems failed. His medical training was extensive enough that he could perform emergency surgery in the field if necessary. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was one of the few female operators in Delta Force, selected not because of quotas or politics but because her test scores and operational performance exceeded those of most male candidates. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, spoke Farsi fluently, and had experience with personnel recovery operations in mountainous terrain. Her psychological profile indicated exceptional performance under stress. Sergeant First Class Ryan O'Connor was a former Army Ranger who had joined Delta Force specifically because he wanted to push the limits of what was possible in special operations. He was an expert marksman, an experienced helicopter crew member, and had a reputation for completing missions that other operators considered impossible. His specialty was making things work when everything else had failed. The 3 operators were briefed on the mission at 8 a.m. and told they would be airborne by noon. This gave them 4 hours to study satellite imagery of the search area, review intelligence reports on Iranian military capabilities in the region, and prepare equipment for an operation that could last anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days depending on what they found. Their aircraft would be a specially modified MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter capable of flying 500 miles without refueling and equipped with advanced navigation systems that could avoid Iranian radar coverage. The pilot would be Chief Warrant Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had flown special operations missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several countries that remained classified. Her reputation for getting special operations teams in and out of impossible situations was legendary throughout the special operations community. The mission plan was elegant in its simplicity. The team would fly a route that followed the border between Iraq and Iran, staying just inside Iraqi airspace until they reached a point directly west of Sarah's last known position. They would then cross into Iranian airspace at low altitude, flying below radar coverage toward her last reported coordinates. If they found her alive, they would extract her and return to Iraqi airspace before Iranian military forces could respond. If they found evidence that she was dead, they would photograph the site and withdraw immediately. Weather conditions for the mission were nearly perfect. Clear skies would provide excellent visibility for the search, and light winds would make helicopter operations easier. The temperature in the target area was expected to reach 125 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon, hot enough to be dangerous but not so extreme that it would prevent the team from operating effectively. As the operators made final preparations for their departure, none of them knew whether Sarah Chan was still alive. She had been missing for over 30 hours, and the desert conditions were severe enough to kill an unprepared person in less time than that. But Delta Force operators were trained to complete their missions regardless of the odds, and they had saved people who had been given up for dead before. At 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time, the modified Black Hawk helicopter lifted off from a classified airfield with 4 Americans aboard who were about to risk their lives for someone they had never met. The official records would show no trace of this flight, no documentation of their mission, and no acknowledgement that American Special Operations Forces had crossed into Iranian airspace. If they succeeded, Sarah Chan would be saved and the operation would become another classified success story known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. If they failed, 4 of America's elite warriors would join Sarah in the Iranian desert, and the United States government would deny any knowledge of their presence there. The helicopter turned southeast and began its journey toward a desert where American lives hung in the balance, and every minute of delay increased the odds that they would find only bones and equipment scattered across the burning sand. Sarah's second day in the desert began before dawn, when the temperature was still cool enough for her to think clearly. She had spent a miserable night trying to sleep on the hard ground, rationing tiny sips of water, and fighting off the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm her survival instincts. The desert night had been surprisingly cold, dropping to temperatures that left her shivering in clothing designed for extreme heat. As the first light appeared on the horizon, Sarah took inventory of her situation with the methodical approach she had learned during years of working in dangerous locations. She had approximately 1 liter of water remaining, enough for perhaps 12 hours if she rationed carefully. Her food supplies consisted of energy bars and dried fruit that would provide calories but would also increase her need for water. Most critically, she still had no idea which direction would lead her back to her vehicle and main supplies. The sunrise revealed a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. The salt flats stretched endlessly in every direction, creating mirror-like reflections that made it impossible to judge distances accurately. What appeared to be hills or rock formations on the horizon might be mirages, visual tricks created by heat and light that had led countless desert travelers to their deaths. Sarah had read accounts of people walking for days toward landmarks that didn't actually exist. She made the difficult decision to stay where she was rather than risk walking in the wrong direction. Moving during the day would exhaust her water supplies faster, and, without GPS or reliable landmarks, she could easily walk further away from rescue rather than toward it. Her best chance for survival was to conserve her energy and water while making herself as visible as possible to anyone who might be searching for her. Using techniques she had learned during wilderness survival training, Sarah began creating signals that could be spotted from aircraft. She arranged her spare clothing into large geometric patterns on the salt flats, creating contrast against the white ground that would be visible from helicopters or planes. She used her camera's mirror and metallic equipment to create reflective surfaces that could flash signals to aircraft during the day. But Sarah knew that her chances of being spotted by rescue aircraft were slim. The search area was enormous, covering thousands of square miles of nearly identical terrain. Iranian search and rescue resources were limited, and the political complications of her situation meant that extensive rescue efforts were unlikely. She was probably going to have to save herself, and she was running out of time to do it. As the morning temperature began to climb toward dangerous levels, Sarah made another decision that would prove crucial to her survival. She began digging into the salt flat surface, creating a shallow depression that would provide shade during the hottest part of the day. The work was exhausting, and every shovelful of salt and dirt increased her body's demand for water. But she knew that exposure to direct sunlight during peak heat would kill her faster than dehydration. The digging revealed something unexpected. About 2 feet below the surface, the salt gave way to harder ground that contained fragments of pottery and metal. Sarah realized she was digging into the ruins of ancient structures, possibly the same archaeological sites she had been trying to photograph when she became lost. The irony was bitter. She had found exactly what she had been looking for, but it might also become her grave. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sarah retreated into her improvised shelter. The shade provided some relief, but the heat was becoming dangerous. She could feel her body beginning to struggle with temperature regulation. Her heart rate was elevated, and she was sweating despite her efforts to remain still and conserve moisture.
This was when Sarah's professional training became crucial to her survival.
As a photographer who had worked in extreme conditions around the world, she understood the physiology of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. She knew that her body's ability to cool itself through sweating would become less effective as her hydration levels dropped. She had to balance her water consumption carefully, drinking enough to maintain essential body functions while preserving enough to last until rescue arrived or night fell. The psychological challenges were as dangerous as the physical ones. Isolation in an environment that could kill her was testing Sarah's mental resilience in ways she had never experienced. The silence was absolute except for the sound of wind across the salt flats, creating an eerie whistling that could drive people insane if they listened to it long enough. The visual monotony of the landscape made it difficult to maintain focus, and she found her mind beginning to wander in directions that could lead to panic or despair.
Sarah forced herself to maintain mental discipline by focusing on specific tasks.
She continued adjusting her signal patterns, moving reflective objects to catch different angles of sunlight. She documented her situation in a small notebook, recording the time, temperature estimates, and her physical condition. Writing helped keep her mind occupied and created a record that might help rescuers understand what had happened if they found her body. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, estimated at over 125 degrees Fahrenheit, Sarah's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Despite her careful water rationing, she was showing early signs of dehydration. Her mouth was becoming dry, her skin was losing elasticity, and she was experiencing headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. She knew she was entering the danger zone where her survival time could be measured in hours rather than days. The most frightening moment came when Sarah began seeing movement on the horizon that she knew couldn't be real. Heat mirages created the illusion of people walking in the distance, vehicles driving across the salt flats, and even aircraft landing nearby. She understood intellectually that these were optical illusions, but the visions were so convincing that she found herself shouting for help before remembering that nothing was actually there. But Sarah's years of experience in dangerous situations had taught her to distinguish between rational fear and panic-induced hallucinations. She used techniques she had learned from military survival instructors, focusing on immediate sensory inputs to maintain connection with reality. She counted her heartbeats, described aloud what she could see and hear, and performed simple mental exercises to keep her mind functioning clearly. As afternoon began to transition toward evening, Sarah faced a crucial decision. She could remain in her shelter and hope that rescue teams would find her before she died of dehydration, or she could risk traveling during the cooler evening hours to search for her vehicle or other sources of help.
Both options carried substantial risks.
Staying put meant relying entirely on others to save her, while moving meant she could walk further into the desert and exhaust her remaining water supplies without finding anything useful.
She chose to move.
As the sun began to set and temperatures started to drop below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Sarah gathered her remaining supplies and began walking in what she hoped was the direction of her abandoned vehicle. She had no scientific basis for choosing this particular direction, but staying in one place felt like giving up, and Sarah Chen had never given up on anything in her life. Walking across the salt flats at night was treacherous. The surface was uneven and often unstable, creating ankle-twisting holes and sharp-edged formations that could cut through boot soles. Sarah had to move slowly and carefully, testing each step to avoid injury that would end any chance of reaching safety. The darkness also made navigation even more difficult, as the stars provided general direction but no specific landmarks. After walking for what felt like several hours, Sarah made a discovery that filled her with both hope and frustration.
She found tire tracks pressed into softer ground near a dried riverbed.
The tracks were relatively fresh, created within the past few weeks based on their condition. But she couldn't determine whether they were from her own vehicle or from other travelers, and she couldn't tell which direction the vehicle had been traveling. Sarah decided to follow the tracks, reasoning that they would either lead her back to her vehicle or to other people who might help her. The walking was easier in the riverbed, where the ground was more stable and the tire tracks were clearly visible even in starlight. She made better time than she had expected, covering several miles before exhaustion forced her to rest. As dawn approached on her third day in the desert, Sarah found herself in a landscape that looked different from the featureless salt flats where she had been stranded. There were more rock formations, scrubby vegetation, and signs that this area occasionally received water.
The tire tracks continued clearly ahead of her, disappearing around a bend in the ancient riverbed. Sarah's water supplies were now critically low.
She estimated less than 6 hours of liquid remaining, and her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her skin was becoming hot and dry, her heart rate was elevated even when resting, and she was experiencing confusion that made it difficult to remember details about her situation.
She knew she was entering the final stages of severe dehydration. But something kept her moving forward.
Perhaps it was her natural stubbornness, perhaps it was the professional drive that had carried her through dangerous assignments around the world.
Or perhaps it was the primitive survival instinct that refuses to accept death until the last possible moment.
Whatever it was, Sarah continued following the tire tracks as the sun climbed higher and the temperature began its deadly climb toward levels that would finish what the desert had started. She had no way of knowing that less than 100 miles away, for American Special Operations soldiers were flying toward her location in a helicopter that didn't officially exist, risking their lives and their careers to save someone they had never met. She couldn't know that her disappearance had triggered a chain of events reaching the highest levels of the United States military, or that her situation had been classified as a matter of national importance by people who made decisions about life and death on a global scale. All Sarah knew was that the tire tracks continued ahead of her, leading somewhere she couldn't see, toward a future she couldn't predict. She took another sip of her rapidly diminishing water supply, adjusted her pack, and continued walking toward whatever waited around the next bend in the riverbed. Behind her, the desert stretched empty and silent under a sun that showed no mercy to anyone foolish enough to challenge its dominion over this corner of the world. Chief Warrant Officer Jennifer Walsh had flown combat missions in 7 different countries, but the flight toward Sarah Chen's last known position was unlike anything in her 15-year career. The modified Black Hawk helicopter was operating at the edge of its range, carrying just enough fuel to reach the search area, conduct operations for 2 hours, and return to friendly territory. There was no margin for error, no backup plan if they encountered unexpected problems. The 3 Delta Force operators in the passenger compartment represented decades of combined special operations experience. Major Alex Rodriguez sat quietly reviewing satellite imagery on a tablet computer, memorizing terrain features and potential landing zones.
His calm demeanor masked the complexity of the tactical problems they faced.
They were flying into a foreign country without permission, searching for a person who might already be dead, in an environment that could kill them as easily as enemy action.
Sergeant First Class David Kim was focused on the medical aspects of their mission.
If they found Sarah alive, she would almost certainly be suffering from severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and possibly heat stroke. He had packed advanced medical supplies including 4 fluids, electrolyte solutions, and emergency medications. But treating severe heat casualties in the field required immediate evacuation to proper medical facilities, and their nearest hospital was over 400 miles away. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was monitoring Iranian military communications frequencies, listening for any indication that their helicopter had been detected. Iran maintained radar installations along its borders, and their air force included aircraft capable of intercepting the Black Hawk if they were discovered. The mission's success depended on remaining invisible to Iranian air defenses until they were back in Iraqi airspace. Sergeant First Class Ryan O'Connor was studying topographical maps and weather reports, calculating how environmental conditions would affect their search operations. The desert heat would limit how long they could operate on the ground, and the terrain would determine where they could safely land their helicopter. He had identified 3 potential landing zones near Sarah's last known coordinates, but all of them carried significant risks. As they crossed from Iraqi into Iranian airspace, the tension in the helicopter increased noticeably. They were now operating illegally in a country that considered the United States an enemy. If they were shot down or forced to land, the Iranian government would have every right to treat them as spies or saboteurs.
The diplomatic consequences could damage U.S.-Iranian relations for years.
But the immediate tactical situation was more pressing than political considerations. Walsh was flying the helicopter at extremely low altitude, following river valleys and staying below radar coverage.
The navigation required constant attention, as GPS signals could be jammed and electronic warfare systems could interfere with their communications.
She was relying on traditional piloting skills, dead reckoning, and visual landmarks to maintain their course toward the search area.
The landscape below them was brutally hostile.
Even from 200 feet altitude, the desert heat was affecting the helicopter's performance. The thin air reduced rotor efficiency, requiring more power to maintain flight. The extreme temperatures stressed mechanical components and reduced fuel efficiency. Walsh had to constantly adjust their flight path to account for thermal updrafts and downdrafts that could slam the aircraft into the ground without warning. Rodriguez was coordinating the search plan through hand signals and whispered radio communications. Standard search and rescue doctrine called for systematic coverage of probable areas, starting with locations where the missing person was most likely to be found. But they didn't have time for systematic searches. They had perhaps 90 minutes on the ground before fuel considerations forced them to begin their return flight. Their first target was Sarah's abandoned vehicle, which Iranian search teams had reportedly located but not approached due to concerns about improvised explosive devices.
The Toyota Land Cruiser was sitting exactly where satellite imagery indicated, approximately 15 kilometers from Sarah's last known position.
Rodriguez studied the vehicle through binoculars as Walsh circled at a safe distance. The truck appeared undamaged and was sitting upright on level ground. Its doors were closed, and there was no obvious sign of struggle or violence. This suggested that Sarah had left the vehicle voluntarily, probably to photograph nearby archaeological sites. But it also meant she was somewhere in the surrounding desert with limited water and supplies. Kim was calculating survival times based on environmental conditions and available information about Sarah's physical condition. An experienced outdoor photographer would have basic survival training and might carry emergency supplies, but the desert heat was severe enough to kill even prepared individuals within 48 to 72 hours.
Sarah had been missing for over 60 hours, placing her survival in serious doubt.
Santos had established communication with their command center, reporting their position and initial observations. The satellite communication was encrypted and routed through classified channels, but it still carried risks. Iranian intelligence services monitored all radio frequencies in border areas, and unusual communication patterns could alert them to unauthorized military activity. O'Connor was studying the terrain around Sarah's vehicle, looking for clues about which direction she might have traveled. The ground was mostly salt flats and rocky outcrops that wouldn't retain clear footprints, but an experienced tracker could sometimes find signs invisible to untrained observers. He was looking for disturbed vegetation, fabric fragments, or equipment that might indicate her travel route. Walsh set the helicopter down in a cleared area approximately 1 kilometer from the abandoned vehicle. The landing was technically challenging due to the loose surface material and thermal turbulence, but she managed to touch down smoothly in a cloud of dust and salt particles. The 3 operators immediately exited and began their ground search while Walsh remained with the aircraft to monitor communications and watch for approaching threats. The walk to Sarah's vehicle took 15 minutes across ground that was like walking on a furnace. The surface temperature was over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause burns through boot soles if they remained stationary too long. The operators were wearing desert camouflage uniforms and carrying full combat equipment, adding to their heat burden despite advanced cooling technologies built into their gear. Rodriguez reached the vehicle first and began a systematic inspection. The Toyota was unlocked and contained Sarah's main water supplies, satellite communication equipment, and most of her camera gear. This confirmed that she had intended to return quickly from whatever expedition had led to her disappearance.
Her absence from the vehicle was almost certainly unplanned. Kim found Sarah's satellite phone and attempted to activate it.
The device was functional, but showed no record of outgoing calls after her last successful check-in. This indicated she had probably left the vehicle without the phone, thinking she would return before needing to communicate with her support team. It was exactly the kind of small mistake that could prove fatal in extreme environments. Santos discovered tire tracks leading away from the vehicle in 3 different directions, indicating Sarah had made multiple trips to different photographic sites. 2 sets of tracks formed loops that returned to the vehicle, but the third set continued in a straight line toward the northeast and did not return. This was almost certainly the route of her final, fatal journey. O'Connor followed the tire tracks for approximately 500 meters before they disappeared into rocky ground that wouldn't retain clear impressions. But the direction was clear, leading toward a series of low hills that contained the archaeological site Sarah had been commissioned to photograph. He marked the GPS coordinates and returned to brief the team on probable search directions. The heat was becoming dangerous even for the specially trained operators. Despite their acclimatization and advanced equipment, prolonged exposure to ground temperatures over 140 degrees was approaching the limits of human endurance. They had perhaps 30 minutes of effective operating time before heat exhaustion would force them to return to their air-conditioned helicopter. Rodriguez made the decision to continue the search by air, following the tire track direction toward the hills where Sarah had most likely been photographing when she became lost. This approach would allow them to cover more ground while minimizing their exposure to the deadly heat. But it also meant they might miss subtle signs that could only be detected from ground level. As they walked back toward their helicopter, Kim noticed something that made him stop and examine the ground more carefully. Partially buried in wind-blown sand was a lens cap from a professional camera, the type of equipment Sarah would have been carrying. The cap was approximately 200 meters from her vehicle, consistent with it having been dropped during her final journey away from safety. More importantly, the lens cap provided a definite indication of her travel direction. It was located along the line projected from the tire tracks that O'Connor had followed, confirming that Sarah had indeed headed toward the northeastern hills. This gave them a specific search corridor rather than the broad area they had been preparing to cover. Santos reported their findings to the command center while the team prepared to continue their search by helicopter. They now had a probable direction of travel, a timeline for when Sarah had left her vehicle, and confirmation that she was carrying camera equipment when she disappeared. But they still didn't know whether she was alive, and their fuel situation was becoming critical. Walsh had the helicopter ready for immediate departure when the team returned. The aircraft had been sitting on the superheated ground for over 30 minutes, and the ambient temperature was affecting engine performance. She would need to be extremely careful during takeoff to avoid exceeding safe operating parameters in the thin, hot air. As the Black Hawk lifted off in another cloud of dust and debris, Rodriguez was already planning their aerial search pattern. They would follow the projected line of Sarah's travel toward the hills, flying low enough to spot a person on the ground but high enough to maintain good visibility over the terrain. If Sarah was still alive, she would almost certainly be seeking shelter during the hottest part of the day. The helicopter banked toward the northeast and began flying along the route Sarah had probably taken 3 days earlier. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly under a sun that showed no mercy to anyone foolish enough to challenge its dominion. Somewhere in that landscape was an American photographer who might still be alive, waiting for rescue that she had no way of knowing was finally coming. Time was running out for both Sarah and her would-be rescuers. The operators had enough fuel for perhaps 45 more minutes of search time before they would be forced to return to Iraqi airspace. If they didn't find her in that window, she would probably die in the desert while help flew away just overhead, unable to locate her in the vast expanse of identical terrain that had swallowed so many others throughout history. Sarah heard the helicopter before she saw it, the distinctive sound of rotor blades cutting through air reaching her ears like a message from heaven. She had been following the tire tracks for over 6 hours, moving slowly through the ancient riverbed as her body continued its steady deterioration from dehydration and heat exposure. Her water was gone, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her vision was beginning to blur from the early stages of heatstroke. The sound came from the south, growing louder as the aircraft approached her position. Sarah forced herself to stand upright and began waving her arms, though the movement made her dizzy and nauseous. She had heard aircraft several times during her ordeal, but they had always been high-altitude flights that disappeared quickly over the horizon. This helicopter was flying low and seemed to be following a deliberate search pattern. Through her camera's telephoto lens, Sarah could see the aircraft clearly enough to identify it as military rather than civilian. The helicopter was painted in desert camouflage and appeared to be flying in a grid pattern across the landscape ahead of her. Someone was actually searching for her, and they were searching in the right area. But Sarah also understood that being spotted from a moving helicopter would require incredible luck. The desert terrain provided natural camouflage for anything on the ground, and her khaki clothing would blend invisibly into the landscape from even moderate altitude. She needed to create a signal that would be visible to trained observers scanning thousands of square miles of identical terrain. Using the last of her strength, Sarah pulled reflective equipment from her pack and arranged it into a pattern designed to catch sunlight and flash signals toward the helicopter. She used her camera's mirror, pieces of aluminum emergency blanket, and metallic components from her equipment to create a display that should be visible from aircraft if the observers knew what to look for. The helicopter continued its search pattern for another 20 minutes, flying parallel tracks across the area where Sarah was stranded. Each pass took it further away from her position, and she began to fear that it would complete its search grid and move to a different area before spotting her signals. Her equipment was creating brief flashes when the aircraft was at the correct angle, but the helicopter was moving too fast for sustained signaling. Then, the pattern changed. Instead of continuing its systematic grid search, the helicopter suddenly banked sharply and began flying directly toward Sarah's position. Someone aboard the aircraft had seen something that caught their attention. Sarah continued waving and signaling until the helicopter was close enough for her to see individual crew members through the aircraft's windows. Chief Warrant Officer Jennifer Walsh had spotted the reflective flashes during her fourth pass over the riverbed area. The signals were brief but clearly artificial, not the random reflections that might come from natural materials or abandoned equipment. She immediately altered course toward the source of the flashes while Rodriguez confirmed the sighting through binoculars. Through the helicopter's powerful optics, Rodriguez could see a person in desert clothing waving frantically from a position beside what appeared to be an ancient riverbed. The individual was clearly in distress, moving slowly and appearing to have difficulty maintaining balance. This had to be Sarah Chen, and she was obviously in need of immediate medical attention. Walsh began searching for a suitable landing zone while Kim prepared his medical equipment for treating severe heat casualties. The terrain around Sarah's position was challenging for helicopter operations, with uneven ground and scattered rocks that could damage the aircraft's rotor blades. The nearest safe landing zone was approximately 400 meters from Sarah's location. Santos was monitoring Iranian military frequencies for any indication that their helicopter had been detected by radar installations or reported by ground observers. So far their operation had remained unnoticed, but landing in Iranian territory would increase their exposure time significantly. Every minute on the ground increased the risk of detection and international incident. O'Connor was calculating extraction procedures for a heat casualty who might not be able to walk to their landing zone. If Sarah was suffering from severe dehydration or heatstroke, she might require a stretcher evacuation that would be difficult to accomplish quickly. They needed to get her aboard the helicopter and begin medical treatment as rapidly as possible. Walsh set the Black Hawk down in the best available landing zone, a relatively flat area between two low hills that provided some concealment from distant observation. The aircraft touched down hard on the uneven surface, but remained stable and operational. Rodriguez and Kim immediately exited and began moving towards Sarah's position while Walsh kept the engines running for immediate departure. The run across 400 meters of desert terrain in full combat gear was exhausting even for operators in peak physical condition. The ground temperature was approaching 145 degrees Fahrenheit, and thermal radiation from rocks and sand created an environment like the inside of an oven. Rodriguez and Kim covered the distance in less than 4 minutes, but both were showing signs of heat stress by the time they reached Sarah. Sarah Chen was conscious but clearly in severe medical distress. Her skin was hot and dry, indicating that her body's cooling systems had begun to fail. Her pulse was rapid and weak, her breathing was shallow, and she was exhibiting confusion and disorientation consistent with moderate heatstroke. Without immediate treatment and evacuation, she would probably die within hours. Kim immediately began emergency medical procedures while Rodriguez established security around their position. Sarah was given intravenous fluids to begin addressing her dehydration, cooling packs were applied to her neck and wrists to lower her core temperature, and electrolyte solutions were administered to restore her body's chemical balance. The treatments were temporary measures that would keep her alive during the flight to proper medical facilities. Communicating with Sarah was difficult due to her confused mental state, but she was able to confirm her identity and provide basic information about her condition. She had been without water for over 12 hours, had been walking in extreme heat for most of the day, and had not eaten substantial food for over 48 hours. Her survival to this point was remarkable considering the severity of conditions in the Iranian desert. Rodriguez was coordinating with Walsh through radio communications, providing updates on Sarah's condition and their estimated time for reaching the helicopter. They needed to move quickly but carefully, as Sarah could not walk unassisted and would require a stretcher evacuation across difficult terrain. O'Connor was preparing the helicopter for immediate departure once the team returned with their patient. The movement back to the helicopter was the most dangerous part of the operation. Kim and Rodriguez had to carry Sarah between them while maintaining their own safety in temperatures that were approaching lethal levels even for trained personnel. The stretcher evacuation took nearly 10 minutes, during which all three individuals were at risk of heat exhaustion that could incapacitate the rescue team. Santos had maintained radio contact with their command center throughout the ground operation, providing updates on their progress and Sarah's medical condition. Medical personnel at military hospitals in Iraq and Kuwait were being alerted to prepare for a severe heat casualty requiring immediate treatment. Advanced life support equipment was being prepared for the flight back to friendly territory. Walsh had the helicopter ready for immediate takeoff when the team reached the landing zone. Sarah was quickly loaded aboard the aircraft and secured for medical evacuation while Kim continued providing emergency treatment during flight. The Black Hawk lifted off from Iranian territory after a total ground time of 18 minutes, heading west toward Iraqi airspace at maximum sustainable speed. The flight back to friendly territory was a race against time and fuel. Sarah's medical condition continued to deteriorate despite Kim's emergency treatment, and she required advanced medical care that could only be provided at a proper hospital. Walsh was pushing the helicopter to its maximum performance limits while calculating fuel consumption and range to their intended destination. Rodriguez was coordinating with military medical facilities to prepare for their arrival while Santos monitored both Iranian military communications and U.S. command channels for any complications that might affect their extraction route. The operation had been successful so far, but they remained vulnerable until they crossed back into Iraqi airspace and landed at a friendly facility. Kim was fighting to stabilize Sarah's vital signs during the flight. Her body temperature remained dangerously elevated, her blood pressure was unstable, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness. The intravenous fluids and cooling measures were helping, but she needed immediate access to intensive care facilities to survive the next few hours. The crossing into Iraqi airspace was accomplished without incident. Iranian radar installations had not detected their helicopter, and no military aircraft had been scrambled to investigate their presence. The operation remained classified and deniable, with no official record of American military activity in Iranian territory. From a political standpoint, the mission had been a complete success. Sarah Chen was transferred to a military medical facility in Iraq where she received treatment for severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and multiple complications related to prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. Her recovery took several weeks, but she made a complete physical recovery with no permanent health effects. Her photographs from the archaeological expedition were eventually published by National Geographic in a special issue dedicated to climate change effects on historical sites. The 4 Delta Force personnel who risked their lives to save her returned to their normal duties without recognition or acknowledgement of their actions. The mission remained classified, and official records showed no trace of American military activity in Iranian airspace during the relevant time period. General Hawkins's decision to authorize the operation was vindicated by its success, but she never received credit for her willingness to risk an international incident to save an American life. Marcus Williams learned that Sarah had been rescued through unofficial channels, but was never given details about how the rescue had been accomplished. He suspected that Special Operations Forces had been involved, but was never able to confirm his suspicions through official sources. Sarah herself had no memory of being rescued, as her heatstroke had caused temporary amnesia about the final hours of her ordeal. The Iranian government never acknowledged that an American photographer had been lost in their territory or that foreign military forces had conducted operations in their airspace. The incident became another classified success story in the world of special operations, known only to a small number of personnel with the highest security clearances. Sarah Chen returned to her career as a documentary photographer, but never again worked alone in extreme desert conditions. She established new safety protocols that included redundant communication systems, emergency beacons, and mandatory support teams for high-risk assignments. Her experience in the Iranian desert had taught her that even experienced professionals could find themselves in situations where survival required help from others. The tire tracks that Sarah had followed during her final day in the desert were later identified as having been made by Iranian border patrol vehicles conducting routine security sweeps. If she had continued following them for another 2 kilometers, she would have reached a military outpost where Iranian soldiers could have provided assistance. Instead, she was rescued by American Special Operations Forces who had crossed international borders and risked their lives for someone they had never met. The story of Sarah Chen's rescue demonstrates that heroism still exists in a world that often seems devoid of hope and compassion. For soldiers who could have refused the mission, commanders who could have declared it too risky, and pilots who could have insisted on safer alternatives all chose to act when an American life hung in the balance. Their actions proved that some people will always be willing to risk everything to save others, regardless of the personal cost or political complications. In the end, Sarah Chen survived not because of luck or accident, but because extraordinary people made extraordinary sacrifices when ordinary channels had failed. Her story is a testament to the courage and dedication of America's Special Operations Forces, who continue to risk their lives in places and circumstances that will never be acknowledged by the public they serve.